This is our first panel on what makes a good professional, and what we're going to be chatting about for the next hour are themes on domain versus process expertise. I was sort of quite encouraged when I was looking at professionalism online. I found a lovely thing from Tina Fey, who I think in a comedy quip sort of puts up, I think, something to do with our theme here of professionalism in terms of domain expertise. She says, politics and prostitution have to be the only jobs where inexperience is considered a virtue. In what other profession would you brag about not knowing stuff? I'm not one of those fancy Harvard heart surgeons. I'm just an unlicensed plumber with a dream, and I'd like to cut your chest open. So I think that's it. What we'd like to cover today is very much that. What is this tension? I mean, how can I be doing my job, actually going out and doing a job in an environment with processes surrounding me, and yet be absolutely technically pure, on top of my field, and as Michael was talking about, always doing the right thing for other individuals, regardless perhaps of the constraints of the workplace or environment in which I find myself. Now, you have a number of things on your seats, reports which the speakers have kindly provided and may well refer to in the course of the afternoon. I'm certainly not going to go through the biographies of the various people, but I thought just to warm things up before we move into questions with you, I was going to call upon Louis. Louis, I was just wondering if you might want to make a couple minutes remarks about the two presentations so far.
Michael, thank you. I think the points that were raised, I think, about the conflict between you as an individual and what your profession stands for, the point that Michael just made about doing the right thing despite the pressures not to, are really, I think, where professional bodies come into their own. And I think it's cyclical. In Thomas Gresham's time, the livery companies and the craft guilds were probably pretty trade union orientated, pretty anti-competitive, a history of protecting their own. The Victorians, to some extent, similarly, the ethos was right about professional bodies, but there was an element of fee structures and making sure only those of whom one's peers approved were, if you like, licensed to practice. I think the late Mrs. Thatcher, as Roderick's touched on, paradoxically did the professions a favour. They were indeed becoming smug, complacent, middle class, largely male, anti-competitive, not fit, perhaps, for the modern world by the early 1980s. And I think, arguably, she did the professions a favour because the professional bodies of the last 30 years, while still not perfect, have recognised those limitations and have actually made big strides in protecting the public interest and being genuinely different from trade unions. The blurring of the two bodies that Roderick referred to has been improved in a number of sectors. I think it's just worth noting that of the three sectors, three areas of work that caused the most problems in recent years in ethical behaviour and, or rather lack of it, journalism, politics and the financial services, it's not coincident that none of those, assuming that each of them is a profession, that's a separate question, none of those had a professional body worthy of the name to make that critical insistence that both the speakers have talked about the critical factors around ethical behaviour, attitudes, integrity that go hand in hand with and are often more important than your professional competence and your technical knowledge. And the old Jesuit saying, give me a boy at the age of 7 to educate and he's mine for life, is absolutely where the professional bodies need to be. There's much more for many of them to do. You've got to get people early about behaviour. Bringing in 100 pages of regulation to try and change somebody who's 35 years of age, or whatever it might be, who's been brought up with a different set of values and a different set of priorities, arguably a different set of key performance indicators, it's an uphill struggle. In America, you tick boxes and that's proof that you are compliant with regulation. Nothing about the principles of how you've acted. So I think the point I wanted to make was that I can't emphasize enough how important since 2008 globally, in particular, where it was clear no one would trust anybody in any country giving advice in the financial services sector, or indeed in many of the post-communist countries around a private market economy growing, that professional bodies have that critical role in influencing the whole careers of the self-employed and the employed to be difficult and annoying, just because they are insisting on, the bodies are insisting on their people qualified through those bodies doing the right thing. And just one final point is the Cass Business School survey many of you might have seen about 18 months ago on the City here in London, showing that of all the city firms they surveyed, 53% did not have any professional qualification, so owed no allegiance to any professional body. And if you did, if you were in the 47% that did, you were much, much more likely to challenge illegal, unethical, corrupt, dodgy behaviour from your bosses or your manager. If you were a woman, you were far, far more likely to stand up and be counted, because rather than being bullied by some nasty male chauvinist pig culture, you said, look, I'm sorry, boss, if we do this, I will have to resign as an accountant or a lawyer, whatever it might have been, before I get thrown out because I'm breaching the ethical standards that underpin my professional qualifications. So very much, I think, it seems to me that in the cycle of where professionalism, professional bodies, ethics, integrity, and the important attitudinal stuff that goes alongside professional competence stands historically, we are now at a really important point for revaluing the intangibles and the professions do the right thing. And we'll come on later today to talk about what that will do, we hope, for trust and respect. And even, I'm working actually with Charlotte Leslie on the Royal College of Teaching concept, and even for teachers, they should have the status of a profession. Historically, as Roderick would know, they were often governed by the church, and monasteries were the quality assurance vehicles right up into the 19th century for educationalists. And they missed out on the 19th century vogue for setting up some form of royal college. The fact they have 5 trade unions doesn't really help either. But I think the time has come for professional bodies to stand up and be counted, to walk the talk, and to actually really demonstrate how important to society and to business and to the economy and to individuals, professional bodies and the people whom they license to practice or they have qualifications through are really earning their keep in the way that Michael described.
Well, thank you, Louis. Before I turn to the audience, I was going to exercise sort of a chairman's prerogative and ask the three of you a somewhat long-winded question. We were discussing last week in the financial services group of livery companies a new concept. Louis, you mentioned journalism, politics, and financial services, and this concept is that we might want to have a professional banker's qualification, which is advancing at some pace. But the interesting thing about that is the assertion was made that only 9 firms had signed up to this professional banker's qualification, but that they comprised some 95% of employees in the industry. And so the question was, did anybody really care? If I work for Lloyd's, I really care what Lloyd's HR department and how I advance matters. The odds of me using this qualification to transit over to Barclays to pick on somebody was sort of almost irrelevant. A second example I would give you is kind of within the NHS. And Michael, I know you've had management positions as well as accountancy roles within the NHS. But I do have circumstances, for example, I'm aware of in South London, where it's been told to me that professionals have been told you have to regulate the amount of supplies, but their professional judgment is that these supplies are needed in operating theatres, and then they come up against disciplinary charges for having used the supplies which their manager told them not to use. So what was the long-winded thing? Well, Roderick mentioned the self-employment origins of the professions. I'm curious, is it the case that we can actually manage professionals in these very large organizations? Is it really the case that we are capable of managing them without destroying their professionalism? Thoughts, gentlemen?
Well, despite the fact that Michael threw doubt on whether university teachers were a profession, I've had quite a lot of experience of managing university teachers over the years as a Vice-Chancellor. So if I can think about that task, which is sometimes described along with quite a lot of other professionals as equivalent to herding cats, I think that actually the only way in which you can manage professionals is by treating them as adults, in a sense. That is, that you have to allow them the time and the space to express their opinions without fear of reprisal, and to argue their case with you, and you have to be prepared to argue back. And it's only if you can demonstrate to professionals that you've fully considered the arguments that they've made that you will be able to persuade them that a decision has to be made and this is the decision that you're going to make. So I think that's the essence of it is, in a sense, a democratic essence. It is that you listen to people's opinions, take account of them, and show that you've listened and taken account of the opinions, even if you make a decision which ultimately they don't like. And I think what professionals become really irritated about is if they feel that their expertise has not been fully recognised and that that something is being concealed from them, they're being lied to, they're being ignored, they're being that you're riding roughshod over their behaviour. And it seems to me that that's, well, as I say, I think that's the essence of managing professionals. It does mean that I think that you have to be extremely careful about the I come back to it, the incentive structures within professions. That is that using mechanisms which are supposedly managerial tools such as performance-related pay and so on, the one that I think is usually most disastrous in dealing with professionals, will be disastrous. That if you try and if you give the impression that you're not valuing their judgment, that you're simply viewing them as people who are demonstrating self-interest or trying to grab things for themselves, then that is a disaster. So I think it comes down to, basically, as we keep saying, it comes down to trust, that you have to trust the people you're managing.
Okay. I agree. By making that distinction, you are what I would call a benevolent employer or leader, and that's different. It's not enough to rely on those institutions. Dare I say, you would argue that motherhood and apple pie is entrenched within the objectives of a hospital. It didn't save mid-staffs. It doesn't save us from bad decision-making. And dare I say, some of the things that happened with the church, you look at the Pope, there was, or dare I say, little children with the church. Just because you have a set of values doesn't mean that you will be doing the right thing. It is about how do we do decisions and follow them through. And that's why there's got to be a counterbalance with, when we talk about employment, with power. Because power is a very influential decision-making process. Political decision-making is not because you're a political party or left or right. It is, I have power, you do as I say, because I utilise power. Yes, but if we're going to go to a different form of decision-making and we want the best one, well, a value-based decision-making where we can come to an agreement. And the more educated we are, easier it is to get the rational part right. And the more we are understanding of the ethical part, the more chance we get the value decisions right. But it's that open-based decision-making which says we challenge the use of power. And that's all I'm asking for. It doesn't matter what the structure is, where we are, but invariably, large institutions wield power, and what we need to do is put a check on that. And one of those biggest institutions which stands outside of an organisational firm structure is the profession. Right? That should be guiding how we utilise the biggest resources in society, because of those big firms. But if they're not guided by the right decision making, I think you'll end up being a big banker.
But I just comment, I think there are two aspects here. One is how you manage professional service firms, all professionals, maybe mixed now, but usually only one professional persuasion. And we'll hear more from Richard Chaplin, and I'm sure more from Gavin and Brooke in the final panel about the role of democracy and consultation and legitimacy in the exercise of power. And then the second type, of course, is professionals who happen to be in a broader business and how you can manage them. And I think Roderick's right, it is about understanding, it's starting from the top with a culture and a set of values and the key performance indicators not being all around money and outputs of various very tangible sorts, but being, and this is more difficult, being as much around some of the less tangible reputational, culture, attitudinal, ethical behaviour characteristics. And that's been much more difficult in the 1998 to 2008 decade, I suppose, of rampant materialism being one of the sole criteria for success, the sole criterion for success. And I think the management has got to be, and this is what the City Values campaign is doing, it's looking and saying, well, what about going back to my word is my bond, an element of mutual trust within an organisation? What about 75,000 people signing up to the professional standards that are being, that Susan Rice, as Michael said, is inculcating? What about the HR professionals having a performance management system along the lines that Roderick touched on, which says we're going to performance manage you not by your contribution to the bottom line, totally ruthless, totally selfish, totally stabbing each other in the back to get there. Let's manage you as a professional with a whole range of other characteristics which we as a firm value. And there are lots of components, really, to get this management right. And the moment the professional service firms start being judged solely by the income of the senior partner and the extent to which success is measured in how many hundreds of thousands or indeed seven-figure sums partners are making, and that's how you judge success, we are doomed. We're going to lose 150 years of heritage. We're going to go back to that wonderful quotation in the Times of 1884 about the legal profession. This is David Canadyne's book you might have read on the decline and fall of the British aristocracy, saying that the legal profession in the 1880s was the most aristocratic. It was a refuge for those from hunting, shooting and fishing every day who wanted to have an amusing time over here somewhere. And it said that the downside of it was that the practitioners treated the clients just as they treated their foxes and pheasants on their landed estates. And this was not breeding the sort of approach that professionalism had been promising. And that's only 4 years after the accountancy profession was established in 1880. So there was a lot of that stuff around. So I think, long answer, saying that I think professionals can be managed, but we've got some major changes, and shareholders will have a responsibility here. The government certainly, as Michael said, will have a major contribution to make in trusting professionals. They're going to have very few civil servants soon. Evidence-based and value-based policy will need to be in the hands of professionals much more than they have allowed in historic times. And I think there's a big opportunity for the professionals to stand up and be counted, but they've got to walk the talk and they've got to be emperors with clothes, and the management from the very top, the chief executives downwards and the chairman of the board, have all got to be playing a critical part. Otherwise it just will not work and will soon fall apart.
Well, I think Louis has us turning Lincoln's Inn Fields back into a hunting ground for clients and their fees. Michael, you wanted to come back on something?
Just an expansion of that, really. The psychologists have got into the field of business, especially economics, and it's all for good. Maslow's motivational factors talks about money being one of the bottom drivers. It would be nice if somebody from HR profession actually read some of Maslow, because then it would talk about developing individuals to really do the altruistic stuff, which is the top of the pyramid. And that's what we need to see more of in the city. And I think historically it was there. The only problem was it was done on an individual basis. and people picked out people relatively easily because it was a small community. We talk about these livery companies. To go up and manage funds, you became freeman, freeman of the city, freeman of your livery. Why? Because you were entrusted. It wasn't just enough to be technically competent. And the essence of that value-based decision-making is there within the city. What we haven't done is modernise it and adapt it.
Well, folks, we have some very professional speakers, but one of the things we like at a Gresham Symposium is to talk about the two characteristics of a professional audience, which is good listening skills, which you've exhibited so far, and good questions. And so what I'd like to do is turn to you, if I may. Probably take questions in groups of 3, if that's possible. Lauren Maitland has a microphone there, so please wait for the microphone. Please state your name, any affiliation you'd like to have, and do speak into the microphone, please, because there are people downstairs who will only hear if you talk into it. Lauren, do you want to come up here? We'll start with this lady up here in the second row.
Hello, my name's Sarah Brown. I'm actually ACCA qualified accountant, and I know Michael. I actually had to teach in China some accountants in 2007 and tell them about corporate governance. And they said, that won't work here because our role as accountants is to make the decisions that have been made look much more legal. A year later, they asked me to come back because they wanted to know about corporate governance because they knew they had to work within it. Now, I know the Chinese work much faster than we do, but I thought that was a huge improvement.
Okay.
I'm Robert Woodthorpe-Brown, council member of Gresham Society, a reinsurance practitioner for over half a century, and to become, where we were saying before, brought up by the Jesuits from the age of 6 to 17, which actually has had a major effect on the rest of my life and thinking. You never get away from it. Firstly, coming up with the Lloyd's slogan, or Lloyd's motto, which is Ubere mea fides, utmost good faith. Yet in my lecture at Gresham about the London insurance market, I described it as, when I joined it, as an unholy alliance between Barrow Boys and Hooray Henrys. The Hooray Henrys had plenty of money, and the Barrow Boys knew how to make more of it for them in not very honest ways. The other thing was that as far as our profession was concerned, there was the Chartered Insurance Institute, which was basically an examining body and little more. The way you learnt your profession was at the feet of other people, especially underwriters. That was the only genuine training because, quite frankly, the Chartered Insurance exams in my day were total rubbish. And when I did get my professional qualification, it was on the basis of 5 years' experience at a managerial level, which was all that was required. Chartered Insurance Institute degree meant that you probably had been working with Nigerians and Nigerians and Ghanaians in some post of the Prudential before you went home to be general managing director of your company. And boy, did you know how to make money then.
Okay. Time for a couple more. Sorry, there's a one at the back. Okay.
Hello. Will Goodheart from CFA Institute. We are one of the professional bodies in the city. We don't work in banking so much. About 25% of our members are in banking. But we work in the investment sector. And I don't think it's a complete coincidence that there have maybe been fewer, certainly not an absence, but fewer scandals and crises in investment than there have been in banking because of the presence of our own professional body and other professional bodies such as the CISI in that area. I do, though, actually have a question for the panel, which is, how do we help professionals annoy one another? I absolutely agree that professionals should be annoying to others, but I don't believe, and I don't see very much evidence for it in other professionals, that we're very good at encouraging professionals within our own professions to actually sort of keep their own skills sharp and to maintain their behaviour at the highest levels at all time. I suppose this is, how do we encourage whistleblowing within professions not just from professionals within firms.
Well, you're a very shy audience, so we'll take a couple more. Gentleman there.
Francis Desiderata, Alpine Venture Capital. It seems to me that several thousand years ago there was a guy called Moses who produced something called the Ten Commandments, which actually worked rather well. I think if we wind the clock forward, Thomas Gresham's period, dissolution of the monasteries, was probably a pretty seminal point in changing things in England. And coming on forward now, we're trying to constantly catch rabbits with nets by regulation and all the rest of it, and constantly failing to do so because we're constantly relying on external mechanisms, external bodies to do this, rather than internal moral codes to check behaviour. And I wonder what the panel think about that.
Okay, and I think we'll still take a couple more up here at the front.
Thanks. I'm Ian Harris. I'm Michael's business partner. I'm a fellow of the Institute of Chartered Accountants in England and Wales, a fellow of the BCS Chartered Institute of IT, and at least one other institute, I think. And I'd like to make an observation and a question. My observation really probably comes from my training as a chartered accountant and my experience of talking to other people who have been trained in that and similar professions, which is firstly that I don't think common sense can be taught, and I have some doubts about whether ethical compass can be taught, although I think that can be taught a little bit more than common sense can be taught. However, my own experience of gaining experience in the profession was that the bar that you needed to cross to pass the exams is fairly straightforward. Some people are good at it, some people aren't, but that's a bar that you can set. The bar about experience is a bar that is fairly corrupt, actually. I don't know very many people who really had all of the experience that you're supposed to have and had that authenticated on their experience forms, that they really had done a little bit of everything and had proved themselves to be good at those things. And by good, I think we're agreeing here that good should be ethical and proving that you are taking a professional approach to everything you do. Now, having your experience forms for your qualification to some extent corruptly authenticated and verified is a terrible ethical start to a profession, and is not unique to the accountancy profession. I think it's there in almost every profession, medicine possibly to one side. And I just wonder whether there is something that we can do at that stage of people's professional development, first of all to develop the ethical compass, and secondly to make sure that the experience and expertise part of the professional qualification is really properly tested and verified and externally moderated.
Okay, two of you have got my eye. Don't worry, I've got you, but I'll pause now if I may. And we've got 5 interesting comments, although I think the last one I would decipher as experience corrupts, and great experiences corrupt absolutely, but we'll leave it at that. So we have, I think that's what you said, wasn't it? So we had China, again, exams versus experience in the insurance industry, the CFAs, and what are we doing there in terms of, sorry, your point was on?
How can we encourage professionals to annoy one another?
That's right, annoying one another. Yes, my handwriting is annoying me at the moment, so annoying one another. And the gentleman back there, I think, quite rightly looking at, what's the roles of morals in all of this. There's a lot to get our teeth into, so I'll take a kind of a first round here of comments and feedback. Michael?
I know about China and all of those things we're getting to see, because I think people are realizing corporate governance is good decision making. So once people in power understand that long-term it's a good sustainable decision making process, they can delegate down. And that was the philosophy behind Foundation Trust. You gave people who you thought were grown-ups enough authority to do their job, you didn't have to interfere with what was taking place. Doesn't always help, as Mid-Staffs was a foundation trust. It still comes back to drivers. On the internal part, we used to do it in the city. In the city, you have a gentle word, or you close the door and have a private conversation, and people can feel the heat coming out of that, and then you move on. Bankers used to have quiet words, or the Bank of England used to have quiet words with bankers or people in the financial institutions when things got risky, and it stopped crisis from happening. That was the difference. And when people said this is errant behaviour by an individual, if you did not change, you would be excommunicated, right? Now, you could do that without legislation. It used to be done. Invariably, we're talking about social or informal mechanisms of control as well as formal recognition. We can do the risk management, pick up the variation. But to tell you the truth, it will work if the people in the professions or within the organisations want to improve the decision-making process. They'll quite happily have words with people, make sure the right thing is done. The real problem is, if somebody says being almost illegal makes a lot of money, then somebody's going to say, we'll take a chance. The problem about the banking crisis for me was, if you tell somebody, if you take a large bet and you get it right, you'll get an enormous bonus. And if you get it wrong, you don't have to pay, the government will pay, and you'll get a large bonus. Right? Now, why do we think, once they work it out, you don't have to tell them, and trust me, they have smart cookies down there, that that's the risk. Why do you think people will stop making large bets? You can pass all the laws you want and anything else. It works out. There was a TV program last night about people who did criminal activities, right? They did it, they knew what they were doing, and they made millions. And the government brought in a piece of legislation, if you make millions from criminal activities, we'll take it away. They'll say, I'll stay in jail, I'll take that bet, because I make the risk and reward assessment. Problem is, we've got to stop the risk and reward. It's not enough with enough people saying this, that, and the other between themselves. If you don't stop the drivers, there will always be somebody who's willing to be very quiet, work their way up into an organisation to get to a position of trust for the wrong reasons. It would be nice if we could get them in early, and we talk about Gresham, the masters behind us, masters of Mercer schools. They got them in early and developed them. That's what schools need to be doing. Not just the, can you get through the, well, I'm showing my age now, the 11 plus or whatever it is, the exams quickly. It is, can you get the understanding and the values? We do need to create the value system and make the right decision making. It doesn't have to be formal, say, Barnes-Oxley's or other legalistic mechanism. If you've got the right people in positions of power and trust. And so we've got to, I think, rethink, who do we vote for? How do they get positions of power and trust? But also, and that's not just in political bodies, I'm talking about to hold on to the institutions, to lead places. And it's thought leadership as well as economic leadership. Because those people are the guardians of the nation and of our wealth.
I'll just comment on the point about the financial advisors and how you get professions to criticise each other. Again, I think, how do you get professionals to criticise each other? I think you simply have to encourage them to do it. And that's often uncomfortable for managers, because one of the aspects that you have to encourage is criticism of yourself. And I think that developing an open culture in which a professional feels that they have the right to criticise their bosses will develop a culture in which they feel that they themselves can be criticised. So it's producing a circle of honesty, I think is the way I would put it, in simple terms, in which people do tell each other honestly what they think. And I think that's a good way of encouraging good performance. If you conceal from people what you think of them, how can you encourage and affect their performance? I suppose I'm influenced in this by the fact that although academics are certainly not immune from concealing their views, there is a big culture within research communities of cut and thrust competition at the most extreme levels. And I think that anybody who's been to a seminar in a leading American university will recognize what I mean. That is that it's vicious. It's not kind of, well, it sometimes can become personally vicious because people sometimes take the criticism the wrong way, but it's not intended to be personally vicious. It's vicious about the ideas. And that's the important distinction, that if you're developing a self-critical culture and a critical culture in an institution, you have to be very careful that what you're criticizing is the decisions or the ideas or the way in which something is being done, not the individuals who are doing that, who are usually, in my experience, acting in reasonably good faith and have to be taken on that ground. So again, I just think it all comes back to trust and honesty.
I think just briefly I'd comment on Sarah's point on China. I think it's becoming increasingly clear to most governments that unless they have got proper professionals in place and an infrastructure in place, foreign direct investment will either not happen or won't happen as quickly as is needed. And I think, you were right, it's very much, from my perspective and experience, the recognition that if you need foreign investment, and there are very few countries that don't, not having people whom you can trust who operate to some sort of international standards and codes of practice is going to be almost fatal. And I think that's good news for London and the London-based professionals who specialise in setting the international standards. The cultural issues are again, very important to understand. What works in Asia Pacific or what works in the Middle East compared with what even in Milan or Moscow. Some very difficult issues about how you may have to compromise some of your professional standards if you're going to survive, and whether you're prepared to do that or not is a pretty key issue for individual professionals and their managers. I think, Robert, our Jesuit friend, I think it's interesting that I think now one hopes that the city, including the CII, I know, and the CISI, have increased both the relevance and the challenge and the quality of the examinations. And it picks up what Ian was saying, that unless you've got the practical side, the apprenticeship bit, learning at your master's feet, as well as having really good professional examinations, as well as having a very clear ethical framework within which you have to operate and know that if you don't, you'll be fired, or at least you'll be expelled. I think it's those three elements which are so important, and I think there have been professions who've been pretty skimpy on experience, and there have been managers quite lazy, or rather busy managers who've been too happy to tick the boxes for the experience that needed to be gained to get qualified, and there's a lot to be done to tighten that up and actually show that the laxity that's crept in. I think going back to apprentices, and as many of you will know, higher apprenticeships now, they're in law, they'll shortly be there in accountancy, and we're going back to what I think is a very practical way of getting the early inculcation, both of professional knowledge through something that's structured as an apprentice scheme, and the conduct and behaviour that is going to be required. And I met some very impressive young apprentices in a legal firm actually in Birmingham, who would never have gone into the profession. They're doing a great job. The firm that employs them loves them. And they're really just very different from the graduates, from the classic Oxbridge 2-1 graduates who are expecting too much, not prepared to work really hard without complaint, and coming in at 18 or 16 actually has a lot of merit if you're trying to manage a professional service firm, and I'm a great supporter. I think just elsewhere, I mean, I think there are issues that have been raised around how you keep the quality of the theory and enforce the necessary standards in the practice, and that's really never going to be perfect. I think if you took the view there might be, say, 2 million professionals, it depends what you deem professional, there are a lot more, but let's say professional bodies may have 2 million people. Well, if 99% are absolutely 100% right, that's still, whatever it is, 20,000 who aren't, and that's what the media will pick up. And I think it's trying to get the perspectives of where are the real issues. And someone picked up on, you know, the peer group annoying each other. 30, 40 years ago, I mean, the bar had 6,000 members when I joined us in the mid-70s with Tony Blair, my year, failing to spot his potential, and now has, I don't know, 15,000. So the smaller of those city firms and the pre-American banks, they all knew each other, for better, not always a good thing, but at least there was much more peer group pressure and much more, probably over drinks somewhere, bawling people out and making sure they did conform if it was going to be detrimental to the firm for them to continue in the way they were doing. So I think the problem that we've got multicultural, multinational, much bigger groups of professionals, and it's much less easy to be naturally annoying and to know who's stepping out of line and to blow the whistle, is part of the issue. And we've got to find ways in which we can continue to find effective ways of peer group pressure so that no Jesuit would think of doing X or Y, and any other Jesuit would actually immediately spot that and say, this is not what we do. They get back into line. And we're missing a lot of that. It's just very difficult to know quite how to bring it back. You can have people tweeting and drawing attention to various failures, but that doesn't always work as well as it used to in the sort of pre-Big Bang days, the pre-1985 days, which were perhaps slightly easier to manage on a sort of conformist set of principles.
Great. Well, we'll turn back to our professional audience. Woman over here on your right, Lauren, and gentleman back.
Thank you. Sue Correct. I'm a fellow of the Association of University Administrators. My question's really more around issues of public perceptions of the professions. I have an accountant I've trusted for 12 years who I would trust far more than any doctor. So quite what we make of that, I don't know. But I'm interested in what the panel think about some of the discussions that have gone on recently, that the public perceptions of some professions are changing because actually members of the public encounter professionals less. If you go into your child's classroom, you're quite likely to encounter a teaching assistant and not a teacher. In a hospital, it may be a healthcare assistant and not a professional nurse or a doctor. You go to report a crime, it's going to be a police community support officer. Now, without making any judgment on any of those particular professional aspects, I'm just really wondering whether we think that's having an effect on public perception.
Okay, thank you. All the way at the back, please, Lauren.
Chris David. Quick comment, observation and a question. The comment was, I think we probably all recognise and probably do support a lot of the elements of professionalism that both Michael and Roderick outlined earlier on, and I certainly do. I worked for a Big Four firm, and then I went on to work for a large US quarterly driven earnings corporate, and I probably observed more professionalism in the latter than in the former. And it leads me to a question around whether, from possibly Louis might be the most able to answer, but any of the panel, what industries, in what professions have they observed, or do they think the standards of professionalism which you were outlined earlier on this afternoon, the essential elements of a professional, where, and this may be in more than one place, have they seen those elements, as it were, practiced best?
Well, that'll be very annoying to other professionals to rate them, but all the way back up to the front, Lauren. Sorry. This woman here in the second row.
I'm Rebecca Doutzen, and I'm a Senior Conduct and Compliance Officer at the Association of Accounting Technicians. We've talked a lot about managing professionals, which is certainly something I do in my day-to-day job. And I found that when you enter into a conversation with a professional about a disciplinary matter, they expect you to embody a lot of the characteristics of a professional. I certainly annoy them, for starters, but I also make value-based judgments, have to work within an ethical decision-making framework. I've had training, rely on experience, and all of those kind of things that you would expect from a professional person. And you know, professions can be anything now. We've talked about it being a footballer, a golfer. You could have a professional decorator or an interior designer. My question is, what happens when you get professional regulators?
Okay, woman here.
Hi, I'm Olivia Bradford. I was having dinner with a friend recently who's a trainee accountant, and he said that he was raising some concerns that he had with some things that were going on within his practice. And I said, well, who are you going to go and talk to about it? And he said, well, I'm not really sure who to approach. I'm only a trainee, and I don't have really any protection in my job at this stage. And I wonder if you guys think that there's any room, you know, or there's anything that can be done to protect those people who aren't quite yet professionals.
Okay, got time for one last one. I've got just here in the third row, gentleman there, Lauren. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ben Kemp. I'm in-house counsel at the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries. Following on from the question that's just been asked, there's a question about whether and what more we can do to support professional people in their role as, in a sense, the front line of self-regulation, if you like. And I say that, we touched on whistleblowing and the importance of speaking up, and the importance of generating a culture of criticism and self-criticism, and that's great, and those are all good things, and may perhaps relatively easy to do where you're working in a positive environment which encourages those things. But where actually you're not, and you're the professional person, the situation has just been alluded to, whether you're a student or a more senior person actually, where your livelihood is on the line, where economic pressures make life very difficult for you to blow the whistle. We talk a lot about backbone, professional backbone as an important attribute. And without going on too long, I mean, the point is how we support professionals in that critical front line of regulation to raise issues and bring them forward. We had someone in my organisation come forward recently, won't go into the details, it's a live case, but they literally walked in off the street after 2 years of concern about what was going on in their organisation, finally built up the courage to raise them. I thought that placed them in enormous credit. They then went and resigned from their position because there was nothing more they could do, change their employment. Quite an emotional state that they were in. But they'd actually taken up that challenge and raised the issues. How do we help people in that sort of situation?
Thank you. I think in the time available for this panel, I'm just going to squeeze one more quick question or comment in, gentlemen there. There is going to be time in the second panel, obviously, as well, but I'm conscious of time.
Hi, Carolyn. I'm retired now. It's a follow-up to the question that was just asked. Since I've often helped people who whistleblow, and there are two questions. One, how do we support them? But perhaps more importantly, how do we include notions of how to whistleblow in training for professionals, or indeed for anyone? It's not restricted to professionals. People who are not professionals often see things but do not know how to challenge.
Okay. Well, panelists, we've taken quite a few comments. Public perception, where is it being done well? How to deal with regulators, and then 3 questions really along the lines of how do we support people who've got issues at the front line? How can they raise issues? How can they whistleblow and do so with confidence? Who would like to kick off? Louis? Perhaps one of those was specifically directed at you.
Well, let's start with Chris, who raised that about who practices best? I mean, I think very often the case used to be that family firms who had a long historical tradition chose their clients with care and turned down a number of clients. And I've known one particular investment bank that run by two friends of mine, still independent, who used to do that regularly through the 80s and 90s. They just refused to accept as clients certain people to protect their own reputation. I think it's easier when you've got smaller firms, perhaps, and the big firms try, it's obviously more difficult. But I think that's where it's practiced best, where you say, right, these are the values, this is our reputation that's at stake. I don't matter how much money we lose by not dealing with this shark or crook, we're not going to even go there. And that begins then to build up everyone believing that this is perhaps a two-way street, that you're actually choosing with care whom you're going to deal with. It obviously can be abused. So I think, I mean, the bar, clearly the self-employed at the bar, I think also I've seen some very difficult ethical dilemmas and very difficult personal positions people got into, but for the public interest, the public good, they were fulfilling their professional obligations. Not easy, I think, in the modern multidisciplinary international firm to decide how you're going to preserve, to set your values, and then decide how you're going to preserve and enhance those values and be perceived in the way that you want to be perceived. But that's, a lot of them are working hard at that. Just very briefly, I'll deal with Sue on not coming into contact with professions. I mean, I think that's true. I think a lot of professionals are business to business, not business to consumers. So if you look at all the engineering professions, you'd probably never meet them. But if the bridge over which you were walking fell down, you'd certainly want to meet the civil engineer, like the wobbly bridge, where it didn't quite work out. So I think you're right. The several factors. One, I think, is you perhaps don't meet them as much as you might do. Your village, where you had your clergyman, your solicitor, your accountant, so everyone knew everybody, is largely gone. And that what you now have is, as Roderick was saying earlier on, a much more intelligent, informed, cynical, perhaps, potential client, prepared to think the worst of a professional, not take everything on trust, combined with the fact you're not sure who's, in a very much more complex world, who is really qualified at what level to do what, and a number of people designed to deal with clients at one remove from the professionals themselves. I think we'll come on to, in just after the coffee break, there's a lot about trust and what's necessary to maintain it and restore it if you've lost it, and some of those issues I think we've dealt with by Hilary Lindsay later on. I think when we came to Olivia's point about her dinner date and the trainee accountant, I think that's a real issue. I think some organisations are running hotlines for anonymous tips. Some are just encouraging people to write in, but it's quite difficult if you're at the other end of that to decide what to do. If you're in a professional body and you've got various tip-offs coming in, quite how you handle those is a very difficult issue, to be fair to the firm, make sure that it's not an aggrieved person putting a knife in completely unnecessarily to try and undermine the reputation of the firm from which they're about to be fired. A trainee's case is very difficult because they want to be there and get trained and stay. So I think it's a big issue for all professional bodies, is this question of finding a practical method of encouraging people to express their concerns. Then once they've done that, working out what is the correct, objective, balanced, thoughtful approach to the firm. Do you phone up the senior partner and say, I think you may have a problem, here's a off-the-record, anonymous help I can give you as a member of professional bodies, regulating staff, that's a helpline to stop you making the situation worse at the accountancy end. Difficult to do. I think the issues we've touched on professional regulators and the difficulties, it's about, I think, having lots of lay people involved as we now all do. It's about making sure that we maintain a sense of perspective and a sense of practical realities and not move into an ethereal, wholly academic sort of assessment, because otherwise you lose trust and respect if you're cut off from the cold face and the full horror of practice. But I think there clearly is a risk that you can, people, not you personally, but people can spend too much time engaged, engaged in regulation, cut off from the wider context in which the practitioners are struggling to practice, if I put it that way. But that's enough for me, I think.
Just two comments. The first on the question of whether people distrust or don't trust professionals more because of the growth of what could be called, what are the ancillary professions, so to speak. I'm not sure. I think that has contributed to the distrust that is felt about the professions, which I think is, to come back to, mainly about what is seen as personal motivation. But I do think that it does pose a difficulty. I mean, I think anybody who has had experience of dealing with a hospital or even a school or any other kind of complex organization from the outside actually finds it extraordinarily difficult to understand the internal structures, the internal decision-making processes, and actually the jobs of the people involved. I mean, I have a granddaughter who's got some complicated problems with her eyes, and despite, being very highly educated, I still find it virtually impossible to distinguish between the different specialisms who are dealing with her, because you'd have to have a rather good course in medical dog Latin in order to be able to interpret their job titles, let alone what has actually happened to translate those titles into what they actually do on the ground. So I think there's one thing that the professional organisations and the big employers could do, which is to make it much clearer than they actually do what the job titles mean, to put it in the simplest terms, but also what the responsibilities of each of the individuals are, so that you don't have a situation in which, a healthcare assistant is being berated in a hospital for failing to do something which is actually the responsibility of either a nurse or a qualified nurse or a doctor. So I think it helps to, as I say, good communication also helps. The other thing that good communication is essential. It doesn't only help, it's essential. The other thing is about, again, openness. I mean, one of the good things about the academic profession, by and large, is that we do accept that people ought to explain not only their findings, their research findings, but also make the data available to people to replicate it. And that seems to me to be a very good professional principle, again concerned with good communication and openness, that you don't try and keep things secret. You do explain why you've come to a particular decision, as I said earlier, or you explain the basis, the evidence on which you've used to come to that conclusion. I mean, it is extremely embarrassing for a large number of politicians and economists that the single most important academic article in economics in the past 10 years, which has been used to justify huge policies of austerity, has just been shown to be wrong by a graduate student who went through the Excel spreadsheets. Great, that's exactly how things should be. I think other professions, apart from economics, could learn from that it's actually a benefit to allow people to replicate, to work through the evidence and to replicate the findings if they can do so, or if not, to overthrow them. So I think openness, again, is the important factor.
Can I expand upon that? Because I should have said that I have been a lecturer in economics, and the same thing was proven with Milton Friedman's work before Thatcher's day. But the person, I can't remember, a South American economist that proved Milton Friedman wrong, career wasn't as good as Milton Friedman's, I'm sad to say, who then went on to get the odd Nobel Prize and other such awards, because there is a driver to do things for your masters as opposed to do the right thing. But we're here to talk about doing the right thing. And all professions have actually in the past had somebody who is not the qualified person at the front door, bookkeepers in accountancy, clerks in law firms. That's always been the structure. So people don't always see the right person, although, at least in healthcare, they're looking to increase the numbers to get more interaction with the public and also to control the quality of care, which is why you want money drives you into breaking up and getting the donkey work done by somebody cheaper, but quality means that you need a professional to at least oversee it and check it. So that's not going to change going forward. Standards of professionalism, a good professional body is not known to the public because everything they do is done well, quietly. The quiet words with individual people we're referring to takes place, and therefore all is well when you don't know who they are, but the industry is run well and people rely and trust upon it, and you don't get the exceptions or the near misses and the risk management. Professional regulators used to be on the board of the Food Standards Agency as regulator, all for it. It is vitally important. There is a little movement for that, not just to regulate professionals, but to regulate any industry where you need regulators, because normally they get people like me who's left over from somewhere else that would get called in, and it would be nice to have some people with the trade skills, the appropriate skills and experience to do the job. But that means that you also have to change the way government sees it, because again you could be embarrassing them going forward. But all for that, and I'm hoping that, dare I say, the people who are auditors have that base skill. A little plug. As for the self-regulation, the professional trainees and whistleblowers, it's okay if you work for somebody like this gentleman who is honourable, a proper leader, but that doesn't always work all the time. We should have a bigger commitment from organisations to be open, transparent, evidence-based learning organisation. And it would be nice if they made more public declarations to that, and therefore could be held to account with their annual report. And therefore, when somebody finds it's not the case, it would be more embarrassing, and the media, who normally has a go at the professions, could be used in a more productive manner. But really, this is what I'm hoping for the role of the professional body. Whether you are the student, whether you are an employee, whether you are a practice, generally speaking, I know it happens in the ACCA, you could anonymise the information going in to the professional body. It is for the professional body, hopefully, to then reflect back to government and stand up for what is right. That's the way in which we can use whistleblowers, because to tell you the truth, I remember in the Bristol case, you had to go halfway around the world before you whistleblowed. That is an inefficient way of whistleblowing. What we need to do is not only make sure they can do so at home, and the only way they will do so is if they can get a job afterwards. Because my question is, if you are not willing to employ that person, to me it says something about that profession or the industry. Because what it really says, somebody who wants an open, transparent organisation is not wanted here. And therefore you have to question the decision making. So if people want to improve the quality of the industry, and this is why professions can help industry leaders, because it gives a competitive advantage. We've talked about that here. We attract a lot of people into the legal profession who sorts out their problem because it's seen to be a robust professional organisation. We need to have more of those industries in order to have a competitive advantage. And as soon as the government understands that, the better it is for the UK.
Well, just before we close, I'm going to turn back to the panel, but I just wanted to share a small story. Tommy Cooper was apparently a man who was always in search of the right word. And there's a great story about Tommy Cooper when he served in the Horse Guards. He apparently fell asleep on sentry duty, which is court-martialable. And he sort of staggers a little bit up and he sees the regimental sergeant major marching towards him, and he realizes he's in deep trouble and he has to dig very, very hard to find the one right word. So So he draws himself up to his full height, he opens his eyes, and he says, "Amen." And so what I'd like to ask the panel are 3 short one-word questions, or one-word answer questions. Firstly, what one quality makes a good professional? What one quality? Secondly, can you make a good professional? Is it outside in or inside out? Is it possible to actually make one? And lastly, leaving your own profession or professions to one side, would you nominate another profession whom you admire? And I'll start, if I may, in order. Roderick.
Sorry, you'll have to repeat. Honesty, I think, would be the first quality of a good professional. What was the second question?
Can you make
them? Well, yes. I mean, an educator like myself would always argue that you can make somebody. Yes. And the third one?
Nominate one profession you admire.
I'm hesitating because it's difficult to choose. I think there are a lot of very admirable professions. I think engineers are probably the ones I would most admire.
And why would that be?
Because I think that in many ways the tasks that they have to perform are the most complicated, and if they get them wrong, the most life-threatening. I mean, you can destroy the city of London, it's not going to kill people. Well, it will kill some people, but not as many as if you build a bridge which falls down. So I think that that's why I admire them.
Okay. Thank you. Michael?
Passion is one. Because if you get the right drive, you do the right thing. You'll work hard at learning the skills, you'll keep to your principles. So if you can get passionate, and this is not about other things outside of this trade, and I'm not talking about the oldest profession, if you can get passionate professionals who are concentrating on their profession, that's the right drive. We can't train, let's go back to Roderick's point, you can't train a professional, you can educate one. As long as you understand the distinction, then there is hope for us. Admire, I spent a lot of time with the medical profession, and they are different from the public perception. I just wish we could have more open debate about what they really do, the pressures they work under, because it's not an exact science, and that's the other thing about profession. You may know the most about the evidence on a particular matter, but you still have to make judgments, and they agonize and they work very hard to do the right thing, so I still admire them.
I'd use 2 words, I think: courageous integrity, which I think is the value that you look for in the best professionals. Back to the Jesuits, I think you can train professionals, but you need to start early. They don't need to be born with those sorts of characteristics. In fact, few probably are. And I would certainly be ranging over science, civil engineering, and medicine. I admire a lot of professions, but I think it's an entirely biased viewpoint. I'd go for the armed forces just to be different at this point.
Armed forces. Well, folks, I mean, it's been fascinating, this panel. Obviously, a lot of annoying things for thought. On a lovely day like today, I think you're acting very professionally by staying in here and all this. So what we're going to do now is take a short break for about 15 minutes and let you stretch your legs. But please, could you really make your way back in here about 5 to 4, and we really will start at 4 p.m. sharp. But before we go, could you please join with me in thanking both of our speakers and our panelists, Louis Armstrong, for getting today's symposium off to a wonderful start. Thank you.